The Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover.
Hello everyone, welcome to Classics World on Your Marques podcast, a new podcast where we're going to focus on one particular car maker and discuss the various highs and lows, the great models, the less great models, and so on. Joining me today is motoring journalist Jack Grover. I've known Jack for almost 10 years now. He's done stints on various Kelsey Media publications and continues to contribute to them to this very day. Beyond that, he's been a motoring enthusiast for pretty much all his life. So welcome, Jack.
Hello, Phil, and hello, everyone. The
first subject of our On Your Marques podcast, I thought, would be Jaguar, the UK car maker. It's been around technically since 1922. I'm sure someone's going to check that out for me. When it started with the Swallow sidecar, and the Jaguar name was, I think, initially used in 1935. So, you know, it's a brand with such long history and global fame / notoriety, depending on your allegiances, I suppose. But crucially, as we embark on 2021, it's a really good anniversary year for Jaguar. And I thought, Jack, we could talk about some of those anniversaries. I'll rattle through them and we can sort of cover them off a little bit in more detail. But the most obvious one is the E-Type, which celebrates its 60th anniversary in 2021, alongside the Mark 10 Saloon. There's also the anniversaries of the XK8, that's the X100, the X-Type, and it's the 40th anniversary of the Series 3 V12 E-Type, and crucially, it's the 120th birthday of the founder, Sir William Lyons. So there's quite a lot to sort of bring Jaguar back into focus, and yet I also think it's a really pivotal time for the marque. I think it finds itself probably yet again at a crossroads in its very existence. So Jack, if we could start with the E-Type.
Of course. You can't talk about Jaguar, and the E-Type is always in the first sentence and has been since 1961.
Well, isn't it one of those cars a bit like Robin Reliant, where people tend to prefix the model name rather than the marque? So, I've got one of those E-Type Jaguars.
E-Type Jaguar, yeah.
I'm someone who does think it's an absolute icon of a car. I love the shape. I love what it represents. A heyday of sort of British sports car design, and a real heyday for export sales and all that kind of thing. But am I right in thinking, Jack, that the E-Type wouldn't necessarily be on the top of your wish list?
You say that like this is the start of some sort of intervention or therapy session.
It's like a confession, yes.
Yeah. Well, for my automotive sins, yes, I've never really got the buzz with the E-Type, and I sort of hoped in a way that would change when I actually started driving the things, when I was lucky enough to get paid to drive classic cars. And an E-Type was actually the second car I ever drove as a professional motoring journalist on my first day out in the field, and it left me completely cold, and they have continued to underwhelm me ever since. And I think I have driven at least one example of all the major sorts, and none of them have been really as good as I sort of believe that people think they should be. You know, you get these, you're sort of expected to come out away absolutely wowed by them, and they just leave me flat. I don't even dislike them. They just don't stir anything in the soul for me at all. They're a real flatliner of a car.
I think that's really surprising. I mean, so was it primarily the driving experience that left you underwhelmed, or does the styling also leave you a bit cold?
Even before I started driving them, I never got what people were on about with the styling and the most beautiful car ever, and it's all sorts of laddish metaphors on wheels. I think the proportions for them are wrong. I think the bonnet is the long flat bonnet, which everyone seems to like, I think just looks weird. I think the fixed head coupes, the windscreen is too tall and too flat, and the roofline's too high. The track is too narrow, so the body overhangs the wheels like a space van, and they just got generally pudgier and uglier and more fussy in the detailing as they went on. So they started off as, to me, nothing special, and ended up looking rather sort of blotchy and ugly.
Well, if you want to send your complaints to Jack Grover via Twitter, you can do so at balloon_fish, because I imagine your opinion is interesting, to say the least.
By contrast, to show that I'm not completely unfeeling, I think the low drag racing version of the E-Type is one of the best looking cars ever, because they sorted the proportions. It's got the wider track, the wider tyres, the lower roofline. They took off all the bumpers and all the extraneous detailing, and they look really good. And they sort of look like what I think people imagine the E-Type looks like, but the standard road-going ones, no, not for me.
What about the romance of it all, though, Jack? The E-Type was this sort of, I think, a kind of culmination of Jaguar sports car engineering from the XK, which was obviously the start point with the XK 120, and I think it was embodied in. I think it represents an era and a spirit of the time, like almost no other car. I mean, I can think of things like an MGA and an MGB, for example, but I think the E-Type probably is the car that epitomises what Jaguar was able to do, and that's build a kind of Ferrari chasing car without the Ferrari price tag.
Oh, absolutely. I don't disagree on that, and I'm sure that part of this is because I was born, 13, 15 years after the E-Type ended production. I was never the little schoolboy, with his nose pressed against the glass looking at a brand new E-Type in the showroom in a world of Morris Oxfords and Ford Consoles and things like that. So it's always been a classic car to me. Then it's always been an absolutely known quantity, and it's never been anything that to aspire to or to shock, because it's always been around. And I think part of one of the reasons why it was one of the kingpins of the classic car movement when it got going, as well as being a sensation when it was new, was that it was such a game changer in all sorts of ways when it was launched. But that's just never. And I can rationalise that in my head, but it's never ever done anything for my heart, and that is obviously a large part of what sports cars particularly are all about. So I think that's part of the reason why it doesn't float my boat.
Well, look, I mean, I think, Jack, you're absolutely entitled to your wrong opinion. But no, anyway, I jest, of course. I mean, one thing I would say about the E-Type, for what it's worth, I think the icon or the image that most people have in their heads are very much of those early cars, the very curvaceous nose, sort of early Series 1 cars. I think, like a lot of British sports cars over the years, I think the sort of the design language evolved, and not for the better. And part of that wasn't their fault. They were evolving it to meet crash regulations, I think predominantly in North America. So I think the Series 2 is less pretty. And I think by the time you get to the Series 3, I think we're into almost a different car. I think arguably
Absolutely.
The E-Type Series 3 should have almost been called something else, because it's what is it? It's wider, it's heavier, it's got the V12 engine instead of the fabled XK engine.
They should have almost called it an XJ. They should have almost called it an XJE, I think, by that stage, because it's much more of a Grand Tourer than a sports car, and I think its image suffers because of it. And
I think that's one of the reasons why I get frustrated when people criticise the XJS that replaces it, because the XJS it wasn't an E-Type. Well, actually, technically, it was a seamless evolution from the E-Type Series 3. It may not be a replacement to the Series 1, but it certainly was a good replacement for the Series 3 as it was. We can all talk about the design language of the XJS, but actually I think it was a good replacement.
Absolutely, no, it was. I think that's exactly the mistake that people continue to make today. But definitely in the 70s when the XJS came out, it was it was obviously literally the replacement for the E-Type, but people had all the wrong sort of ideas about what the E-Type was by that stage.
By way of closing on the E-Type in particular, one thing I was going to sort of comment on in particular was the prices of E-Types today. I mean, I've been around in the sort of the motoring scene now for long enough to have remembered the day when you could still just about pick up a Series 3 E-Type for maybe sub 20. And, the idea that you can pick up, say, a Series 1 E-Type for less than six figures, I don't think that exists anymore. And that's before you then go on to some of the more bespoke special recreation models, whether it's from Eagle or Jaguar themselves. I mean, you start to talk telephone numbers. I mean, it's crazy.
But again, that's that's because it is an icon, and I'm quite willing to admit that I'm in the minority of people who probably, even if I won the lottery, would never have an E-Type in my dream garage. So, and lots of people do, and that's what drives the prices.
Yes, no, it's very true. I mean, I think I would have an E-Type in my garage, but it would have to be one very similar to the one I drove from S&G Barrett. It was their 4.2 Series 1. It was just it was so well set up. I mean, I think you talk about driving examples that maybe not being the sort of the best condition or the finest of fettle. I think this one was, and it just felt so tight and just so well, planted on the road and agile. I loved it. It was such a raw experience. I thoroughly enjoyed driving that one.
You see, I think this is because we haven't actually talked about my opinions on the driving experience of an E-Type. I can't fault it as a driving experience on a sort of objective view. They drive incredibly well, and for a 1961 car of that performance, they're incredible. They are so planted and stable and easy to drive staggeringly quickly. But I think that's one of the reasons why I don't get excited by them, because I like particularly my classic sports cars to be quite exciting. I would much prefer the sort of clinging on for grim deaths feel you get driving a big Healey than the sort of E-Type, which almost does a lot of the work for you. And if I'm going to drive a 1960 sports car, I don't really want one that does all the work for me, and they are almost too good for the they're almost too good to get me excited from a sports car, which is why, conversely, one of my, not only my favourite Jaguar but one of my favourite cars of all time is the early XJ, because that is pretty much the same underpinnings as an E-Type, and yet it's in a saloon. That's exactly what you want. It's the E-Type, I think, is neither one thing nor the other, and I always like my cars to be kind of very good at one specific thing, and the E-Type is so well rounded. I think that's why I don't gel with it. Interesting.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating that you talk about the XJ Series 1, because I do think that is also a particularly iconic, very well used word, but that's such an iconic car in the Jaguar range, and again a real high point for the Marque.
So you said in your introduction that the E-Type is the pinnacle of Jaguar, certainly at sports cars. I think the XJ is the Series 1 XJ 4.2 is the pinnacle of Jaguar, full stop, and certainly the pinnacle of its saloon car production. I think that was everything that William Lyons had ever been working towards since he started making full-size cars, and I think that was their pinnacle. And as I'm sure we'll get on to talk about later, they've kind of struggled to ever do anything with quite the same just shocking level of competence and overreach all the way in everything, and they sort of almost overspent themselves in the late 60s and have tried to come up with anything quite as good.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with the XJ. I think it was such a pitch perfect product in terms of what it was intended to do, and I think it really shook that luxury saloon market up for quite a long time. So much so that I think Jaguar themselves struggled to replace it, as you referred to. But briefly, just to talk about the predecessor to the XJ6 Series 1, and of course, because that is also celebrating 60 years, and that's the Mark 10. Now, I've driven a Mark 10 and actually thought it was a lovely thing, but just too big for sort of Britain's roads. It just such a behemoth. That I think that was kind of an example of perhaps not quite getting the concept sort of right. It was comfortable, it was luxurious, and all this sort of thing, but it just, for me, it didn't quite hit the mark like the XJ did. But still a lovely car. But obviously, being launched in 1961, it kind of lives in the E-Type shadow somewhat.
No, I agree with that. I've only driven one Mark 10, and it was not the finest example of the breed, but I like that. I would have a Mark 10. I'd preferably a rather shabby one in my dream garage, because they are just, as you said, they are fundamentally good cars to drive. They're very pleasant in a very Jaguar saloon wafty sort of way, but they are preposterously huge. I know they were designed for the American market, where they're verging on compact for the 1960s American luxury car segment, but yeah, I mean, they were the wide. I think that for years it might even still be the widest British saloon car ever made, and they were the biggest monocoque body car.
Isn't it wider than a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow?
I'm sure it is, at least by I think it's it's a matter of inches, but yes, I think it is, and wider than a lot of commercial vehicles. I think it was not until the 21st century that you started getting the big transit vans that were wider than a Mark 10. They were huge cars.
Wider than some aircraft carriers of the time. I don't know. But, I'm reaching for that Basil 40 quote. Yes, most of the cars in England have steering wheels, sir. So
yes.
We just don't need cars that big or that wide. It's just not something we need.
You do wonder what they were playing at. When it gets to the stage where it's not just the width. The doors were so big, and obviously once you've built them with all the Jaguar wood cappings and leather trim and chrome door handles, they were like bank vaults. They started having to put helper springs on the hinges so that you could actually open the things. And you'd think when you get to that stage, someone would have sort of stepped back and think, hang on lads, this car's massive. But no, they kept on, and I'm glad they did, because this is particularly with me when it comes to Jaguar, all roads lead to XJ. But this is what they did. I remember I interviewed Michael Quinn, William Lyons' grandson, a few years ago, and I asked him what, in his view, William Lyons thought of, what his taste in cars was, and he said that as far as he knew, and as far as his opinion and his feeling was that the Jaguar saloons were William Lyons, over the course of 35 years or so, developing his idea of what the perfect luxury saloon car should be, and it was a case of experimentation, pushing the boundaries, seeing what worked and what didn't. And the Mark 10 was one of those ones where he went off in a direction, it didn't really work, and so he came back, did the 420, and then that led on to the XJ, which, as we've talked before, was pretty much spot on. Yeah,
it's interesting that I hadn't really thought of it like that, because if you think about the sort of Mark 7 to 9 saloons that went before, you can then see how the Mark 10 is the perfect segue between that very sit up and beg traditional saloon and the XJ that followed it. So that's a really interesting observation. That
once that's pointed out, you look at them and you can see the styling progression. Even the Mark 7s and the Mark 9s, they've got that curved C pillar in the rear quarter windows and all the little things, and then you can see the Mark 10 is scaled up with bits of the Mark 2, and obviously it's got the running gear from the E-Type essentially underneath, and it's pulling together all these strands. But yeah, it's an evolution, as is one of the sort of parts of the mythos of Jaguar, is that Sir William Lyons doodled these things freehand and styled them using bits of bent wire in his garage at home and things like that, and they are very much his vision and his work, and that's I think one of the reasons why old Jaguars are so sort of soulful, to use a cliche, but it's true, because like a lot of cars that are the work of one person, they have that person's character and taste and views in them, and that's, I think, why in a way they're so easy to love, apart from the E-Type, of course.
That's that's a really interesting point, and perhaps we'll come on to Jaguar design a bit later, but I think that there's something really useful in that comment about when it's the vision of one person, i.e. not a committee of management and accountants figures sort of pointing out little details. It becomes a much more emotional design that might not be perfect, but it's a very clear design language that hasn't had to go through various focus groups to get to its end product. So the other more recent anniversaries is it's 25 years of the XK8 X100, that is. The coupe was unveiled in March 1996, and I think the convertible was unveiled the month later at the New York show in April 96. It was obviously the much delayed replacement to the XJS. The XJS had been around for 21 years by that point, which is an absolute age in car replacement cycles, but the reasons for that sort of delay is reasonably well documented. But I do think I've driven loads of XK8s over the years, because I was the editor of Jaguar World magazine for a few years, so I had the privilege of being able to drive quite a few of them. But I think it was a real kind of great example of sort of ingenuity, because they didn't have much time to develop it and they didn't have much budget to develop it, and yet actually what came out was a pretty decent product, I reckon.
I would agree with you there. The XK8 is the I'd probably say the only one, that might be being a bit strong, but it's my gut feeling, so I'm going to run with it. The only one of the Jaguar sports car series that I actually positively like. And going back to the thing I said earlier, I think that might be because that is also the earliest Jaguar that I can remember personally wowing me when it came out. Because I was 10 when that came out. And obviously Jaguar had launched new, with lots of inverted commas that you can't see on the podcast, around it before 1996. But that was the first one that actually looked new. And I can remember it coming out. I remember seeing the adverts for it. I can remember seeing the first one I saw was just must have been a week or so after they came out. Or you said you could buy them from dealers. And my sister and I went to a school that did Saturday morning school. So often when we were picked up for lunch, we'd go to lunch to a nearby TGI Fridays as a treat, and we were just finishing our meal, and a brand new XK8 convertible. This was a convertible in that metallic sort of electric blue that a lot of the launch models and
Antigua blue, I think that's called.
I knew you'd know the exact name, and it pulled up outside, and I was putting my nose pressed up against the glass, looking at it in the car park, and my mum managed to sort of collar the woman who was driving it and came into the restaurant and said, my son and I think she had both her kids would really like to look at your new Jaguar. And she said, oh yeah, except my sister had just been tucking into a Mississippi mud pie full of chocolate ice cream and chocolate sauce and jelly worms, and sort of opened this brand new XK8 cockpit with the immaculate white leather, and sort of had to sort of steer her away from it. But she just picked it up from the dealer for her husband. Her husband had just bought it. I think, if I remember right, it was a birthday or anniversary present. And so, a special car. But that was, again, the first Jaguar that I can really remember being wowed by personally, and I think that's why they'll always be rather special for me. The fact that they're really good to drive and just genuinely very good cars helps, of course, but I think as it's the emotional response, and that's the indefinable thing which can make or break cars.
And what a birthday present! That's maximum husband points there. I think that's very impressive. I mean, I drove one to the south of France in 2000, so 20 years ago, and I was 23, 24, something like that, and I just thought I'd won the lottery. It was just such a special car, and the driving experience was lovely because it was comfortable. I loved the V8 engine. I think it was, it continues to be a good engine. I think they're still using it. They're about to move production from Bridgend to Wolverhampton, I believe. And I just think it's such a well-rounded product. And when you consider that, as I say, it was effectively a kind of reboot of the XJS platform, with some new suspension and new engine and stuff. And there's a lot that's new about it, but I think they focused what budget they had on all the right areas. And retro styling is always risky. I think we've had this conversation before about other cars, because once you do a retro style, where do you then go?
Yes.
But with the XK8, I think it actually works. I think it's a really kind of faithful tribute to the E-Type without it being too much of a pastiche that it looks wrong. I think it's clearly trying to mimic some of the elements of it with the curves and everything. And actually, the rear end I don't think works as sort of well, where they've had to sort of taper it up to the sort of high tail point. But I think the overall shape is very accomplished.
No, I agree. I think the looks of the XK8 are spot on, and I. Certainly as a 10-year-old, I didn't notice that it was meant to be sort of retro hark back to the E-Type until quite a long time after it had come out. And the way I did that, because my dad was also a big fan of the XK8, and it became his dream car. And for Christmas, I think actually my mum actually bought it, but I was allocated to give it to him one of those 1/18 scale model XK8, so I could give him an XK8 for Christmas. And it went on in his study on his shelf next to a similarly scale model of an E-Type that he had, and it was only when I was looking at them together that I noticed, the grille's roughly the same shape, and it's got the same rough waistline shape, and if you look on the inside, it's got the same circular dials with the 4 little dials in the middle and things like that. And it's only then I noticed, they have actually plucked little details from it, but not the whole styling concept, to use a rather airy-fairy term, of the car. And I think it's a really good example of looking into your back catalogue without overdoing it. And I'm sure we can come and think of many times in Jaguar's history where it has gone too far the other way and not pulled off quite so well.
I think one thing I also like to say about the XK8 is that it's also, for me, a really good example. Jaguar have done this a lot in its time, where it's steadily evolved a model over its lifespan, so that it never really changes radically, but you can clearly see the kind of arc of change and improvement from the 1996 cars to the 2006 cars that rolled off the production line before they were replaced by the all aluminium car. And I really sort of like that. I like the progressive improvements. The engine went from 4 litres to 4.2. The gearbox went from 5-speed to 6-speed. The interior got better. They started adding more technology. And Ian Callum was the chief design director by that point. So the wheel dimensions got bigger and bigger. Now we could argue about what that has as an effect on the ride quality, but clearly launch cars were on like 17-inch wheels, and then 20-inch was de rigueur by the end. But I do like that steady evolution, and consequently a kind of a run-out model like a 4.2S would be the one I'd go for, actually.
Yeah, no, I agree. Jaguar are very, very good at doing the detail changes and keeping models fresh on a tiny budget, and you could almost look at their history and say that they're very good at that, and what they struggle is when someone actually gives them a lot of money. They often struggle to know what to do with it, and it is. I mean, on the flip side, of course, there's always you said yourself there that your pick would be a run-out model. That Jaguar models tend to have an unsettling habit of only in their late years becoming the car they always should have been in the first place, and which is good if you're looking to buy them, years or decades later. But as a commercial prospect, when you're trying to get them out the showrooms, is maybe one of the areas where the company's struggled.
Yes, that must be frustrating if you're trying to sell them and you know that the first generation XJ40 is a bit of a dog, but actually by the time you get to a 4-litre S model or a gold special edition XJ40 of sort of circa 94, it's pretty much spot on. And an XJS 4-litre Celebration, for example, again, fabulous. That AJ16 engine and the styling, everything just looks perfect, I think. It's a shame that they don't get it right sort of first time, but I guess they wouldn't be the first manufacturer, because there's always going to be a pressure on getting a car launched, at a certain time and capitalise on certain other conditions. I don't know, but I like that about the XK. Now, one car that's also celebrating its anniversary next year, the 20th anniversary of the X-Type. Now, I was the editor of the Jaguar World magazine when that car was introduced, and I went on the launch in France, and there was so much hype and expectation. This was going to be the BMW 3 Series competitor. By that point, the BMW 3 Series was selling more cars in the UK than the Ford Mondeo. It had become the ubiquitous middle-sized saloon, the family favourite, the fleet favourite, and all that kind of stuff. So the X-Type clearly had a lot to live up to. And there's just, I think you could write a book about the X-Type. It might not be everyone's bedtime reading, but I just think there's so much that was good and yet so much that was wrong about the car. Because we talk about XK8 and its retro styling and how that worked well. I think that it's probably the benefit of hindsight saying this now, because I probably didn't pick up on it at the time. But the XJ derived styling, when you're trying to pitch to a younger audience and your marketing is talking about the new Jag generation and all this kind of stuff, and then you bring out basically a baby XJ, which its styling is clearly derivative of an X300 or something of that ilk. I don't know, have you driven an X-Type before?
I have. I've driven a few very briefly, not enough to really form a decent impression. The only X-Type I've spent a lot of time with was the one that was a project vehicle on our Untitled Classics Monthly, the one which was bought for some tiny sum of money, which I can't quite remember.
£350, I think it was.
On the expectation that it would be an example to show all the flaws that you get with a cheap X-Type, and then proceeded to be one of the most reliable cars in history, if I if I remember correctly. It only needed it only needed a few sort of sensors and stuff doing to it over the time they had it. But
it was all maintenance stuff. It was all maintenance stuff. I think we had to spend something stupid like the same amount again as in the purchase price, on just new tyres because it needed new tyres, for example. So we'd spent 350 quid on good quality new tyres, and then, like you say, it was often serviceable consumer items that needed doing with it. But yeah, that £350 X-Type continued to surprise and amaze lots of people when we showed it, because when you showed them, people that didn't necessarily know about cars would go, well, that's probably a £5,000 car, isn't it? And you go, well, no, it's £350, and they would sort of be utterly shocked. But here's the thing, I just think, besides the sort of styling, which I think was just too derivative, there was also the thing that I think there was a really interesting piece when it was out, when it first came out, where everyone was trying to bury the fact that it was based on Mondeo, on a Mondeo platform, and it had a Mondeo gearbox and things. And I never really understood that kind of approach, because to deny it really only makes people worry. Well, why are you denying it? Because in a way, there's nothing to. We know that Ford owns Jaguar. We know that Ford have the Mondeo. FYI, the Mondeo is actually a pretty decent car, so don't be ashamed of it. It's arguably one of the class-leading middle-sized saloons on the market. So it was starting from quite a good base. But I went to the technical presentation of the X-Type before we were allowed to drive it up at Whitley, and actually had the MTX 75 5-speed manual gearbox on a stand in the sort of exhibition hall for us to look at, and it had Ford casings all over it, Ford stamps all over the sort of the casings, and yet there they are sort of trying to say, well, it might be based on a similar Ford model, but we really don't want to make a big deal of that. We've done an awful lot of refining and honing of this product and all that kind of stuff, and I think that was unfortunate, because it kind of, by denying it kind of almost inadvertently brought more focus back to the fact that it was based on a Ford, and then that kind of probably led people to form various prejudices about it's not going to be a proper Jaguar because it's basically a Ford, which was unfortunate. I think some of the interior quality was not as good as it could have been, and they launched a car with just two V6 engine options, when obviously its competitors were offering 4-cylinder petrols and crucially diesel engines. So it kind of started life a little bit hamstrung from that point of view. There was also no estate model until about 3 years later. So its competitive edge was already quite blunted before it even started, really.
Yes, no, I quite agree. And that, again, is just Jaguar's perpetual problem of not having the resources to play with the big boys, and yet continually trying to do so. And I can only echo exactly what you said, that you launch a car into one of the most aggressive and competitive segments out there, the small executive car, going up against some of the biggest, most wealthy firms in the business. And it's a struggle that it's going to struggle for any car company to break into that, and Jaguar particularly, because there's a very fixed idea about what a Jaguar is and should be. And Jaguar's value is really only in its image. And the X-Type, you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to thread the needle by saying, we'll do a Jaguar, but we'll scale it down. And it'll still be the very classically British, classically styled, sort of William Lyons style XJ look with the wood and the leather. And then we say, well, if it's a Jaguar, it should really be sort of had very large petrol engines. You can't have a diesel Jaguar, for heaven's sake. That's not the done thing. And they haven't got the budget they've got to launch the thing, and the time pressures they're on, and the packaging of under using the Ford platform and things mean that it gets launched with V6 petrol engines only, and yet that's not what the segment wants. Sharp looking, modern, crisp cars that blend in but look good, with a very particular sort of engines that look, do well from a car tax perspective and won't break your bank and things. And so they keep trying to keep trying to play the game to their own rules, and they're not big enough to write the rules. And that's, I think, fundamentally why the X-Type flopped in terms of meeting its sales predictions. It sold, a third of what it was meant to? Something like that?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I think its original projections, wasn't it meant to sell 200,000 units a year or something? And it might have absolutely at its sort of peak point got to about half of that, but I think it always struggled to live up to that expectation. I mean, another thing that kind of happened really right at the start, because they were so nervous about the Mondeo thing, was that they made a real big thing about the four-wheel drive, and I I can't even remember what they called the four-wheel drive system. I don't know, it almost like to sort of really lay the point down. Oh, but it's 60% biased to the rear, so it's almost like a rear-wheel drive car. But
Jaguar, yeah.
And it's like, yeah, well, okay. And then, of course, they then sort of scupper that by then introducing the 2.1 V6 model, which was only front-wheel drive, and therefore kind of, revealing the kind of the falsehood that this was very much a four-wheel drive or a rear drive biased kind of engineered car. And then, of course, the diesels come out in 2003, 2004, and they're front-wheel drive as well. So by then, they, just 3 years on, they'd sort of abandoned this whole thing about it being a rear drive sporting thoroughbred and just gone with what, as you say, the market probably wanted in the first place. And then, of course, by the time they do the facelift model, in about, was it 2007, 2008, I think it is, with the slightly different grille, they've only then finally brought out a diesel auto, which, again, the market really wanted. The audience wanted a sort of relaxed auto diesel, but they didn't have that until, I don't think it was even engineered, it wasn't even possible from an engineering perspective until quite a bit later. But, of course, by the time that facelifted model had come out, arguably, the game had moved on yet further, and the Audi A4 and the BMW 3 Series and the Mercedes C-Class had all had replacement versions come out by then and moved the game further forward. And the X-Type kind of just felt like it wasn't able to stand toe-to-toe with that opposition by then, which I think is a pity, because, again, what we said about run-out cars, the last of the line X-Types are probably the best ones to go for, but, even then they're sort of their competitive edge is blunted. So I don't know, I think when I was the editor of the Jaguar magazine, I managed to compare the X-Type against pretty much all of its peers, and it was, every group test was a little bit depressing, because it basically never, I don't think it ever won a twin test. I even pitched it against a Subaru Legacy and gave the Subaru Legacy the nod, which I think gave Jaguar's press department a bit of a headache, because I think they just thought, oh, what are you doing? You're the editor of a Jaguar magazine and you're saying this Japanese four-wheel drive saloon is better. I mean, what are you doing? But it just felt like that was the truth. The Jaguar X-Type wasn't a bad car, it just wasn't a great car, and I think that's the shame. And yet, I don't know, they're great value now if you can pick one up, and they're not unreliable particularly. I don't think. I think they're still good cars. They rust, don't they? They've got.
Yes, they do.
I think they make great second-hand cars, and but I don't know whether it'll ever be remembered as a particular high point in Jaguar's sort of model history.
No, I think it'll go into the file of sort of bad planning and slightly botched execution that was kind of on the cards from the start. I think they just it's one of those. The compact executive car game is a game that has rules, and you've got to be able to play them and hit the ground running. And if you can't, it's not going to work. It's like like the people who drive such cars. You turn up for marketing meetings and you're expected to wear a suit that has a particular look and style and colour to it. And you turn up in a dark grey, dark blue, black business suit with a white tie and a white shirt and a plain coloured tie. And if you turn up in a Harris Tweed Savile Row 3-piece suit, very stylish on its own merits, but you're going to be a laughing stock. And the X-Type was always that. It was always trying to do its own thing in a market which doesn't really reward individuality in that sense. Oh, and Jaguar Traction 4 was the name of the four-wheel drive system.
Traction 4, that's it. Thank you. That was bugging me. I had all sorts of other random names like 4-Track and stuff. No, that's the Daihatsu all-wheel drive car. But yes, I think basically it coulda, woulda, shoulda, and all that. But if the X-Type had come out from the get-go with a range of petrol and diesel engines and had the sort of 4-door saloon and a 5-door estate model, maybe even a coupe, maybe even a 4-seater convertible, and crucially an X-Type R, like a supercharged flagship car, then I think it might have had a shot at glory, but I think it was just never quite enough, and that's a shame. When we talk about, as we did earlier, about the zenith point being the XJ6 Series 1 and how perfect an execution of a model that was, the X-Type just wasn't quite in that same league, unfortunately. But but never mind. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I think it's probably a really good opportunity to take a quick coffee break, but we will be right back after the break because there's plenty more Jaguar stuff to talk about. So we'll see you after these brief messages.
Introducing a fabulous series marking the most iconic moments in Jaguar's history. Jaguar Memories is a 100-page quarterly book series celebrating the very best of this luxury British car maker. Jaguar has experienced huge highs and lows in its near 100-year history, and this series aims to cover all those key milestones, from the models, the people behind the brand, and the iconic moments from history that have defined this famous marque and made Jaguar what it is today. Issue 1 is on sale at $8.99 including UK delivery, but you can also subscribe and get all 4 issues from just $28.77. So if you own a Jaguar or you're an enthusiast of this popular British marque, what are you waiting for? Visit shop.kelsey.co.uk and then search Jaguar Memories. Prices quoted are for UK only. Overseas rates apply. Visit shop.kelsey.co.uk for more details. You're listening to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover.
Well, welcome back to Classics World on Your Marques podcast. On this episode, we're talking about Jaguar, and so far we've covered off some of the models that celebrate anniversaries in 2021, and we can carry on from there, really. There's one anniversary, Jack, that we didn't cover in the first segment, and that was that it's 70 years from when Jaguar first competed at Le Mans, 1951. And I thought it'd be quite a good opportunity to discuss Jaguar's foray into motorsport in general, actually. William Lyons was very much the kind of adopted the adage of win on Sunday, sell on Monday type thing, didn't he? And the Le Mans campaign of the 50s was a tremendous success for them and really kind of put, again, Jaguar on the sort of map in terms of sports cars and its pedigree.
I think it's basically the thing that made Jaguar, put Jaguar in the market position that it's held and tried to hold on to ever since. I think it's what finally sealed the deal on them being from a specialist little maker of slightly odd but very British saloons and sports cars into a global player. So I think it is I think it's one of the key things that makes up this magic that we keep talking about with the marque as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's the time it kind of almost joined the grown-ups table, didn't it, in terms of car makers, because it was suddenly standing toe to toe with some makes that had been around in motorsport for many decades before then, and here we are, a relative upstart in the market come the 1950s was now sort of beating the big boys with the Jaguar C-Type. And wasn't the C-Type also it was the first car with disc brakes, I think?
I think it was, yes. So certainly at least the first one with 4-wheel disc brakes. I think I'm slightly fuzzy.
Yes,
on
that might be right. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, certainly disc brakes at the back. Yeah, I think you're right there. It's but again, that also helps if you can be a manufacturer with a first. That also helps, doesn't it?
Yes, and then I think the thing that Jaguar were really good at was taking not just using the image of the win on Sunday, sell on Monday thing, but actually taking the technology from their racing and putting it very obviously into their road cars. Obviously, the E-Type was really the ultimate version of that, because that was effectively a 2-seater, slightly toned down D-Type. But it was very obvious that we've won Le Mans with our 4-wheel disc brakes and our XK engine, and then we're going to give you the same disc brakes and the same engine in a Mark II saloon and an E-Type and everything like that. So it wasn't just marketing fluff. It was, you could genuinely see the link between the racing cars and the production models, which I think is one of the things that gave Jaguar that aura around it in the time.
And I think crucially and probably wisely, they dipped in and out of Le Mans relatively quickly. They sort of capitalised when they could and when they could be in a winning position, but they didn't hang around. They didn't outstay their welcome, did they?
Yes, I mean, I'm afraid motorsport history is really not my strong point, and particularly Le Mans. I'm thinking, did Jaguar ever have a bad spell at Le Mans? They seem to have turned up, won, gone away for 30 years, come back, won, and left again. So it obviously does their record very good, because it means that no one's turned on the telly or opened the newspaper and seen a Jaguar losing.
I'm fascinated by the fact that Jaguar kind of re-entered Le Mans in 1988 with that kind of iconic silk cut Jaguar. I think it's because I think it's really intriguing that a company like Jaguar, that come the late 80s had a really ageing product line and had sort of managed to extricate itself from the British Leyland bear trap. And yet the first thoughts was, well, let's go racing at Le Mans and spend millions of pounds doing that. But actually, again, it was probably a really useful distraction from everything else that was going on. And again, they had success in 88 and I think 1990. And I think that it probably gave them a kind of a halo effect that they probably were unable to achieve in the short term with the product line that they had.
No, I absolutely agree. The XJ40 had struggled onto the market and then had kind of struggled in the market, and certainly took a few years to find its footing. They weren't getting any of the millions and millions of pounds it would need to develop a new product range, but they had enough to... Well, I say this, they were very canny in outsourcing most of the actual work to TWR, of course, who actually managed the whole project for them, which was, I think, a very astute move on their part, because they get all the glory and relatively little of the effort and the risk that goes into it. And of course, they made very good use of TWR for lots of other stuff as well. So
they'd worked with Tom Walkinshaw on the XJS touring car as well in the early 80s from memory, and I think that competed at Bathurst in the early to mid 80s as well. So the relationship with TWR was clearly a strong one, and stood them in good stead. And then they worked with TWR on the Jaguar Sport range, I think, that sort of materialised with the sort of XJRS and the XJR, whatever it was, XJ40 edition, which was actually nothing more than an XJ40 in a body kit, basically. But it was enough to allow them to sort of spin a bit more glitter, if you like, on the model range, which was quite sensible, I think.
And they had TWR working on the mooted F-Type, the XJ41 and 42, which employed a young fellow called Ian Callum, who no one had heard of at the time. That turned into the Aston Martin DB7, and a lot of the work in that then begat the XK8, which we've already talked about. So I think that partnership bore a lot of fruit, I think, in a very short amount of time, really, and it doesn't seem to get mentioned a lot in the sort of broad history of Jaguar. It seems to leap straight from the John Egan years to the Ford years without really going into the detail of what they were doing in the interim.
No, that's very true. And actually, for those motorsport fans that do remember these things, it did that sort of 80s campaign at Le Mans did act as a sort of a start point for some really quite notable motorsport careers. I think David Coulthard, the Formula One driver, was in certainly one of the teams. I think it was the 1991, and Ross Brawn was an engineer on the team, and of course he went on to have magnificent success with Benetton and Ferrari, and now he's the sporting director, I think, of Formula One as a whole. So, he's done all right for himself. So it's an interesting project from that point of view, because it certainly seemed to utilise some really young and eager brains at the time that went on to bigger and better things. So that was quite interesting. I'm really interested in the Formula One campaign. It's the year 2000 that Jaguar entered Formula One, effectively rebranding the Stuart Ford team that started in 1997. And again, I was kind of in the front row at this when this was all happening, because I was the editor of Jaguar World. I think I've mentioned that about 800 times so far on this podcast. So Joe might have to edit that a bit in case anyone was in any doubt. But I think my point is that I was reporting on the fortunes of Jaguar racing at the time, and I don't know. When I first saw the kind of Jaguars going racing, you couldn't help but be a little bit cynical at the rebranding exercise. It didn't look, because it was so obviously the Stuart Ford car with a sort of Ford Cosworth engine in the back. This was nothing more than a kind of, certainly from the outside, it looked like nothing more than just a glorified marketing campaign. The Jaguar engineering element of it was virtually zero. So I don't know quite what they were hoping to achieve from the get-go, other than to try and give a bit more sort of global glory for the Jaguar name.
The Jaguar Formula One effort came along at the tail end of my interest as a youngster in Formula One. I haven't followed Formula One for decades now, but I was quite into it for a period, and Jaguar was at the end of that. And I remember they started their first, I I think it was their initial signing. Johnny Herbert was one of the drivers who was initially signed up, and I rather liked him at the time. So, and again, I liked Jaguar, and it's that weird thing where it's sort of felt right. It felt that Jaguar should be racing, even though, as we've sort of recounted, actually their racing heritage as a works outfit is remarkably brief and spotty, even though it's successful. But it feels like everyone carries this image of Jaguar in their head that they should be a racing team, and of course Jaguar should have a Formula 1 team. Why shouldn't they? And that's a really great thing. And it's, you look at a British Racing Green painted F1 car with a leaping Jaguar painted on the side, and you think, yeah, that looks right. When actually there's, as you said, there's actually no sense to it at all, and it was all a rather cynical marketing exercise. But it sort of just speaks to what you have in your head as what Jaguar should be. It's which in a way probably speaks to it. It was actually quite a canny marketing move, even if as an engineering and as a racewing exercise, it didn't really pay off.
I think bizarrely, there is certainly evidence that it was helping to bring Jaguar to the forefront of younger potential car buyers. It's just that the success on the track wasn't happening quick enough, and I think when I was sort of just rereading some of the sort of the timeline, because they were only in it for 4 seasons, or was it 5 seasons, 2000 to 2004, but it was quite clear that Ford kind of did it and then quickly lost patience with it, and to be fair, they were going against a very dominant Ferrari team at the time and McLaren and all that, so they were really up against it in terms of what they were hoping to achieve. And you've also got to look at Toyota, who were trying to campaign at a very similar time with perhaps even bigger budgets, and they withdrew without any success ultimately as well. So, I mean, Jaguar are not alone at trying to sort of step into the piranha pit that is Formula One and not quite manage the success that they would have hoped for. But it was quite clear that they'd poached Eddie Irvine, I think, from Ferrari, so they went for this big name signing. And of course, there's that, I don't know whether it's myth or truth, that they were looking through the Ford payroll and saw Eddie Irvine's sort of, whatever it was, $8 million paycheck, and he was something like the most highly paid Ford person on the books, which I think raised a few eyebrows. And of course, the success just wasn't there. I think they finished 7th in the constructors' title for about 3 years in a row. But as I say, the tragedy of it was really, I think, had they stuck at it, and had they kind of persevered, they would have, I think, got there. I think they would have generated the success that they would have needed to perhaps cultivate the image and the kind of market sector that they were perhaps aiming for. It's just that I think they run out of budget and run out of patience. But you've only got to see how Red Bull took the team that it acquired in 2005 and then became 4-time world champions from sort of 2010. It shows you what might have been had they stuck with it.
Yes, no, I think it's just another case, and this podcast is really turning into an endless litany of these, that it's just a case of Jaguar setting its sights very high and then doing its best without having the resources that virtually everyone else has. And Formula One is Jaguar wouldn't be the first or last team to enter Formula One with high hopes and then lose a lot of money and not find much success in it. It's a very, very tricky game, and I think you're right, though. I agree with you. I think had they stuck at it, I think the talent would have been there, and it was just they didn't have the long-term funding needed to it. And of course, Ford was going through all sorts of turmoil at the same time, so I'm not surprised they looked at the Formula One effort and thought, not worth it.
Well, it's really interesting. I was lucky enough to be at a dinner with the team principal at the time, a guy called Tony Pennell, who said to me, and whether it's true or not, I have no idea, but I have no reason to doubt what he said, that actually technically the Formula One team was profitable, or operating in a budget surplus by 2004. But of course, Jaguar was having bigger problems outside of the Formula One space by then. They just announced I think profit warnings and the imminent closure of Browns Lane, and the job losses that would have come with that. And I think to many people it just seemed a bit churlish to be sweating it on a Sunday in the Formula One to not earn any points or win any trophies when you're laying off workers in Coventry. I guess it's just a bit of a tragic episode, really, in Jaguar's attempts to sort of step up again and achieve a certain amount of motorsport success like they achieved in Le Mans. But it does make me wonder why they, rather than going into Formula One, why they didn't try Le Mans again, or even something like touring cars, either British touring cars or DTM in Germany, because that might have achieved, the same sort of level of success or sort of the halo effect of motorsport that they were looking to achieve.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I could only guess maybe they thought that Formula One, obviously as well as being the most high status, has the most global audience. And I suppose you wonder, would you get American would-be Jaguar buyers tuning into Formula One or tuning into British Touring Car Championship? Can you see someone in a Californian dentist tuning in to watch a modified Jaguar XJR going around Brands Hatch on a wet Sunday? Probably not. Although it would have been interesting to see it try.
No, indeed, yeah. I mean, interestingly, we've for a long time been associated with the Jaguar Enthusiast Club racing in the UK, and that's often been fantastic close racing. Whether it's people charging around, a Silverstone or a Snetterton or something like that in an XJS or an XK or something like that. It's incredible. It's really close racing, and in a way, that's probably done more to promote the driving and dynamic qualities of Jaguars than some of the modern day stuff. But I think it's a shame that they've not managed to make a success in motorsport. I know more recently they've obviously started to campaign in Formula E. I'm not sure how relevant that is for them in terms of selling road cars. There seems to be a high perceived value of entering Formula One. I think it's Formula E, because I think it's quite a cost-effective motorsport formula that's promoting the future and electric vehicles and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know how well it's doing for Jaguar in terms of translating that into sales. But they're obviously having a go at that, and I think they're achieving a reasonable amount of success. I have to say I don't really follow it, but it's obviously something they're keen to stick with by the sounds of it. So if things like the E-Type, arguably, and I think you mentioned the XJ Series 1 were high points of Jaguar, and potentially the sort of Formula One episode was a low point. I was interested to know your take, Jack, on maybe other high points or low points in the Marques history. I
mean, I think the X-Type we've already covered, and we went into that in some depth, definitely is a low point in terms of the road cars. Then obviously there was the corporate low point in the mid to late 70s, early 80s, where they came very close to shutting shop altogether. That wasn't really the fault of the cars. That was all brought. That was really just due to the sort of curse that seems to have dogged Jaguar all the way through, which is just they suffer from terrible bad luck in the times of timing about wider global events. It's like XJ6 definitely a high point, and then they introduce one of the world's finest luxury cars, and they give it a big 5.3 litre V12 engine, and then they spin off a Grand Tourer E-Type success with the same engine, then bam, fuel crisis hits, and then the world goes into a massive economic recession. And
what's your take on Jaguar in the BL era? Because it was clearly, Jaguar always occurred to me to be a really, strong, independent brand, very much with its own ideas about what it should be doing and its place in the world. And it, as we discussed earlier, it had success, at things like Le Mans, and it proved it could mix it with the big boys. And yet here it was being amalgamated into this sort of British Leyland conglomerate and potentially being swallowed up. The BL era feels like a really precarious time for the brand.
I think it was, yeah. I mean, amalgamation was always going to happen. Jaguar had to merge with someone to secure its body supplier, and the dilemma facing William Lyons was either he had to take the financial gamble of Jaguar setting up its own body shop, which would then, it would then become a entirely self-sufficient car manufacturer that did its own engineering, made its own drivetrains, and made its own bodies. But for a company of Jaguar's scale, that was just not going to stack up. So he had to look for someone, and he weighed them up between British Motor Corporation, as one of them was, and Leyland Motors. Hated Donald Stokes on a personal level, so went with BMC, and then of course 2 years later Leyland got hold of it anyway, which didn't please him. And so William Lyons was very canny, as he always was. You don't get to his position by not being good at business, and he was very, very certain to make sure that he got a spot on the BL board, and that Jaguar was always treated as a sort of semi-independent subsidiary. So you didn't see any badge engineering, you didn't see any corporate engines going to Jaguar. Jaguar remained its own thing, which probably saved the brand's image in the long term, but also probably did an awful lot of damage to BL as a whole, because you had this, one of its prime brands, most valuable marques, with probably the best reputation going in, which deliberately stayed aloof and just sort of sat on the outside chucking spanners in the works by refusing to cooperate or do anything. And although obviously it got caught up in all the labour relations and quality issues that were endemic at the time, they didn't end up with a badge engineered princess as a Jaguar or something like that, or
there's a thought.
or an a 2.6 E series or a Rover V8 going into the XJ, which would have just been horrible.
But by the sounds of it, it's a miracle that they did survive the 70s. But one of the things that I've observed with all of this, of course, is that it survives the 70s despite all the knocks, the industrial relations challenges, the quality control issues, and the kind of challenging launch to the XJS, which, like you say, was launched with a V12 engine into the middle of a fuel crisis, and also we talk about the fact that there was no roadster or convertible available from launch, because I think there was fears that such cars would be outlawed in the States because of sort of rollover crash protection, which none of that I think came to fruition, but that's what sort of stunted the idea that there should be a soft top version from the get-go. So there was a troubled launch of a new model, and then all the kind of, as you say, the challenges of being part of a bigger group. But what that also means is that come the sort of 80s, the kind of John Egan era, you've actually got a company that's not in a great fit state, because you've got now an ageing model lineup, an old factory infrastructure, not a huge amount of money to invest in new models. So, it felt like quite a slow, painful kind of evolution throughout the 80s that then led ultimately to the sale to Ford right at the tail end of 1989.
It's often talked about as if John Egan came in, cracked some skulls together and turned around the whole company in about 5 years, but it took at least a decade from 79 to 89 to really start seeing Jaguar get to come back to some of its former glory, and then arguably it didn't happen until the mid-90s, where again with the XK8 coming out and then the XJ8, you sort of got the sense that Jaguar had finally got back to the position where it sort of had the 70s gone better, where it would have been in the first place. So no, it was you're right, a very precarious time for it. I can't remember what the exact sales figures were, but if you look at them in the 79-80 period, it was real touch and go whether Jaguar would even survive. They were essentially grinding to a halt just because no one was buying their cars.
Well, if you think about it, by the end of the 70s, they'd had to sort of hastily bring out the Series 3 XJ, because I think technically the XJ40 should have replaced the XJ, but that was delayed and delayed again. Come the turn of 1980, you had a fuel-inefficient XJS that hadn't sold in the numbers that they'd hoped, and I think was definitely on the verge of being axed. I don't know whether I'm being unfair on John Egan, because I think you sort of hinted at it just then. I don't think he transformed the company. I think he managed to polish up the shop window to make it look more appealing to a potential purchaser.
Yes, but I don't think you can really say that was a sort of lack of achievement by Egan. Anyone going into Jaguar at 79 was faced with such not just a mountain to climb, but a whole series of mountains. And you'd have had to have tackled the infrastructure in the factories, the design studio, the technology that you actually used to build and design the cars, the quality problems at the suppliers, the build quality problems at the factory, the labour relations problems at the factory, the marketing, the styling, just everything. And I think he came in, took a look and said, well, we need to at least get the basics of building the cars that we have to a half decent standard. And although they were never perfect, they were much better than they were in the mid-70s. He stabilised the ship so that it didn't look like it was going to sink anymore. That's basically what it is. He proved that Jaguar wasn't a busted flush.
I remember in 2002 I did an interview, I think to mark 50 years of the Browns Lane factory, and I'd spoken to the press department about possibly trying to speak to a factory worker who'd been there a long time and could perhaps just regale us with tales of building cars at Browns Lane. They found this guy, I think he'd been there for like 30 years or something, so a reasonably long time. And we sat there having this lovely chat in the famous Jaguar HQ at Browns Lane, and the guy proceeded to tell us stories about how in the strike-ridden 70s they would regularly have their lunch on the leather back seat of a partially built XJ. And I could see the PR person sort of recoiling in horror that, this was not quite the image I think they were trying to convey, but it kind of shows where they were and where they got to, which I think is, an achievement. And of course, like you say, John Egan, I'm probably being unfair on his achievements, but he did, I think, manage to get things ship shape so that whoever took it on at least had a sporting chance of making it work. But we should never underestimate quite how much Ford had to spend to get it up to speed, because I think, didn't they sort of comment when they sort of came into Browns Lane and said it looked like something out of Eastern Bloc sort of communist Germany or something like that, in terms of how good the factory infrastructure was?
Yeah, I think you're right. I can remember reading an anecdote that from somebody who worked at Browns Lane saying that the biggest change that the most sort of immediate, obvious, big scale change that Ford made was that when the production line was renewed for, I can't remember if it was the X300 or the X308, I think it would have been the X300. That was basically the first time the whole factory had been gutted and modernised in one go since about 1950 something. And the biggest change was that you no longer needed to wear full strength military grade ear defenders on the line, because beforehand it was just a sort of cacophony of arc welders and flapping belts and hydraulic presses and air compressors and things. And then the new Ford line came in and it was all modern robotic electric stuff, and you could actually hold a conversation without shouting at the guys working away at you 2 feet to the left. And it was the first time that Jaguar had actually had anything approaching a modern production facility, and that's what they were trying to build XJ40s with in the late 80s. They were trying to build a computerized car with an electronic dashboard going up against the Lexus LS400 on a production line from the 70s. I think Ford gets a slightly bad rap as treating Jaguar as a kind of British traditional car theme park when you look at some of the styling and marketing choices they made in the era, but I think the behind the scenes stuff doesn't really get the appreciation that it should, and I don't think Jaguar would be anywhere near where it was today without them. I think it's a timing issue that Tata took over Jaguar from Ford before the XF came out, I think, and the XF was all Ford's work, but Tata gets to take the credit for it, and it makes it look like Ford didn't really know what they were doing towards the end, and we're just going to keep making Lyons style aluminium bodied XJs forever. And then it seems that Tata came in and did a clean sweep, and actually it's exactly what Ford were working towards all the way. It's just they had to bail because they were in danger of collapsing at home at the end of the credit crunch, of course.
That's again one of the we've mentioned it a couple of times about Jaguar's unfortunate timing, is that Ford spends, as we said, billions on improving progressively over many years the product lineup. Come 2006, they bring out the new X150 all aluminium XK, and they'd had the X350 all aluminium saloon, which was, I think, the last Jeff Lawson penned car, which was therefore the last with the retro styling, even though it had all this modern aluminium construction. And that took until 2009 or something to replace it. So all of Ford's effort had gone into replacing the XJ with a more curvaceous looking shape, that sort of X351 design, the XF, and indeed the XK. So they had this lovely rejuvenated model lineup, but come the sale to Tata, only the XK had seen the light of day, and then of course they go into this sort of the global economic crisis, where the sales for those cars was never going to be fully realised, unfortunately. The model range come 2010 was actually looking pretty decent, because it had the XK, the XJ, the XF, three very strong models, I would say. And by the time the world starts to drag itself out of the economic crisis that it found itself in at the turn of the sort of 2010s, the love affair with saloons had all but ended, and people were buying Range Rovers and other luxury SUVs, and they weren't buying big saloons. So just as the Jaguar XJ saloon had finally got its sort of new look styling, which tried to sort of mimic the Series 1 a little bit with its big, bold, confident grille and its swoopy styling and all that kind of stuff. People had stopped buying luxury limos and were buying, bespoke Mercedes SUVs or Range Rovers or whatever.
I mean, that's I can only echo that entirely. I'm looking at the notes I made in preparation going into this recording, and right at the top I have a note that says always suffers from bad luck, and one of the examples I've got is got good at making saloons just as SUVs gain prominence. So I can only echo what you said.
The only consolation there, of course, is that Jaguar by then was at least part of Jaguar Land Rover, so one half of the company was able to benefit, while perhaps the other one was struggling really. But I guess that leads on to my kind of sort of final point, its future, because we're recording this at the start of October 2020, and the sales figures for September had recently been revealed. Jim Holder, who's the editorial director at Haymarket, commented that DS, so Citroen's luxury brand, is within 100 or so registrations of Jaguar in Europe in 2020. And it's not that far ahead of MG's car sales in the UK. On the one hand, probably really good news for DS and MG. It's slightly alarming that Jaguar sales are at that level. After everything that's gone on, all the investment, all the new models, the new styling and everything, it finds itself having to battle with some very niche players, which I struggle to know what its next steps can be.
Yeah, I mean, those are shocking figures. I had no idea of that. I mean, DS and MG are, I mean, MG obviously is an old brand, but as a company they're both basically startups, and DS one is surprising. The MG one is almost shocking, because I've been following MG in its revised form since it landed, and I would have not, if you told me then that in 10 years time they would be knocking on the door of Jaguar's sale figures, I would have assumed that was meant that Jaguar are doing really badly, and I don't know. It seems to be that case.
Playing on that bad timing theme again, it feels to me that Jaguar spent a small fortune on building its own dedicated engine production facility in Wolverhampton
just before Dieselgate.
Yeah, and it opens up in 2015 with this all new engine. Right on the precise moment that diesel falls into some degree of notoriety for all sorts of reasons, and Jaguar quite rightly could claim this is one of the cleanest diesels in existence, and actually it's just the wrong time. Suddenly diesel as a form of propulsion started to decline in its popularity. This was their big investment, and it's such a shame from that regard. But even jumping on the SUV bandwagon took a while, and I guess there was some resistance to doing it, maybe because they didn't want to tread on Land Rover's toes, or maybe it wasn't considered to be very Jaguar to do an SUV. But by the time they've done it, they've got this sort of aluminium F-Pace, as good looking as it is, it just not quite enough, too little too late kind of thing.
I think so. I mean, you almost couldn't make it up, could you? We were talking earlier about how the problem with the X-Type was that it was launched only with petrol engines and no decent diesels, and then the XE, which was meant to put the ghost of the X-Type to bed, comes along, and the problem is that it's got diesels and no decent petrol engines. It's you imagine some people at Jaguar must be just tearing their hair out saying, what do you want from us? The problem the modern Jags have is that unless you're sort of emotionally invested in Jaguar, do they really have a standout reason to buy one? I'm not entirely sure that they do, and it's something that you have to kind of almost convince yourself to buy, and you can't. It's if you're looking at an F-Pace or an XE or even an XF against any of the bigger selling, wider established competition. Jaguar struggled before with being almost too individualistic, and now they're kind of trying to blend in, but without offering anything unique, and that's a really, really hard knife edge for them to walk, and they seem to be struggling to pull it off.
From one perspective, you can look at the current range and think, great, they've got this XC saloon, an XF saloon, they haven't got the XJ at the moment, because again, another classic case of bad timing, just as they bring out the XJR Super Sports Saloon 50th anniversary of the XJ lineup, so WLTP emission standards effectively kills the car off. But they've got two very decent saloons, a couple of SUVs, they've got this all-electric I-Pace, which seems to have been certainly very critically well received, and of course they've got the F-Type sports car. So the range seems quite decent, and actually from the reviews I've read, and I've driven some of these more modern models, they are relatively well received. It's just that that it's perhaps not. It's just not enough. Maybe it's not enough choice. The XE is just a 3-box saloon. It's not available as a coupe or an estate or a convertible, and yet an Audi A4 or a BMW 3 Series is. So that's a shame. And then so they end up sort of, I think, trying to take on the likes of BMW and Audi and Mercedes, and then sort of pulling back slightly and going, oh well, no, we want to compete with Porsche or Tesla or something like that. And you think it all feels a bit reactionary, like it's not, there's not enough of that hitting the nail on the head first time like they did arguably with the E-Type or the XJ Series 1.
It's the tale as old as time as far as Jaguar is concerned. They're trying to do an awful lot with not very much. I got some figures in front of me that compare Jaguar and its competitors in terms of how much they're spending on research and development as a proportion of their stated cash reserves, and JLR is massively ahead of the likes of BMW and Mercedes. But of course, when you look at what that amount actually is, they're far behind. JLR is spending as much as they can get away with, basically, to try and keep pace, but it's not. It just doesn't seem enough. It's, they're spending as much on developing a whole new diesel hybrid system for the XE as Mercedes probably spend in developing their door hinges. The high volume game, particularly these days, that they're trying to play is an all or nothing game. You can't do it at half speed.
The other worrying thing is that personally, I like the styling. I love the Callum era of cars. I think he's achieved a certain timeless design that history will look quite favourably on. But what's really interesting, when you look at the correspondence that we get through Jaguar World magazine and to some extent Classic Jaguar magazine, the sort of those real enthusiasts that are kind of dyed-in-the-wool Jaguar fans, they don't seem to be that receptive to it. The larger, louder voice that we get to see through emails and letters that we get in on those magazines largely rejects the current generation of styling, which is a concern because it means that your kind of traditionalists, your loyalists are not likely to spend money on those new cars. But by equal measure, they're not bringing in the new audience to replace them. And I think that's one of the unfortunate situations that they find themselves in. They are potentially losing favour with some of the dyed-in-the-wool traditional buyers, but not winning over enough new blood to grow the business.
Again, they seem to be backed into a corner that must be very frustrating to work with. I remember reading one of the problems with the S-Type, the 1990s one. Although it took its first year sales were very, very good. Something like a quarter or a third of all people who bought S-Types were actually existing XJ customers who had realised that they didn't actually need a car that big. It appealed brilliantly to people who already bought Jaguars, but not to the people who, the BMW, Mercedes and Audi buyers, and in the States, Lincoln and other brands, that they needed to get the figures that they'd anticipated. And it's just I don't know how they do it, and I imagine there must be lots of meetings at Jaguar trying to suss this problem out as well, but it is a concern.
I mean, I really hope. I mean, I've been a Jaguar fan since I was a boy, so I mean, I really hope that they find a way out of this. And bizarrely, the future, I guess, may look indeed very similar to how it was 40 or 50 years ago. It might have one sports car and one saloon, and maybe in brackets an SUV, a petrol hybrid and a full electric alternative, and that's it. And it plays the sort of niche, desirable, low volume game rather than trying to step up to the masses to compete with some of the bigger German manufacturers. You've
completely gazumped what I thought was going to be my startling point. that
your one revelation.
No, I was also going to, that's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say I can see the future being that they go back to having a big saloon, a sports car, and then maybe an SUV along the lines of the I-Pace. Because the new XJ, when it comes along, is going to be an all-electric, isn't it? Is that still the case?
I believe so. I believe so.
I think it'd be very interesting to see what that's like, because that really will be, I think, a car that should define what Jaguar is going to be for the future, because that's an update of a very long established and much liked model, but on an all new platform for an all new era, with electric being the norm. The I-Pace, the critical response to it and the awards it's won is overwhelming. I mean, it's the first British car to win European Car of the Year since the Rover SD1.
Although should we be worried about Car of the Year awards, given that the Talbot Horizon was once the beneficiary of that very gone?
Yes,
so I don't know.
Eco-T is not a not an infallible seal of approval. And it won the Triple Crown at the World Car Awards, which I think no car had ever done before. And the reviews I've read and watched seem to be varying from ecstatic to positively cautious. And it seems to be ticking all the right boxes.
But again, is it going to be enough to take on the might of a Tesla, or because of course the bigger manufacturers, the Mercedes, they're coming out with their all electric equivalents. So while iPace might have had a very brief period in the sun as being the only legitimate alternative to a Tesla, now we're already seeing the landscape open up, and there are a gazillion prestige all electric cars that are now available that people can spend their money on.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, the thing is that the iPace and sort of technical competence and the way they drive of the XE and the XF just reaffirms that the problem at Jaguar has never been the talent behind people actually designing and setting up the cars and building them, and it's all the backroom stuff that's always held them back. It's always been the corporate side, not the car side. And does Tata want to keep funneling the billions in the hope that it pays off? And they've been incredibly magnanimous up to this point, but at some point you suspect someone in Tata HQ might start casting an eye over it and saying, well, what exactly are we getting out of this?
Maybe they need to pull in the group's strengths and start building all cars out of Tata steel and selling every car comes with a lifetime supply of PG tips or something like that. Maybe that's the answer. But I suggest we take a quick break. I want to come back with a few final thoughts about Jaguar. So we'll touch base again after this very short break. Speak soon.
Do you own a Jaguar, or are you a fan of this prestigious British marque? Then get your regular fix through one of these two great magazines, Classic Jaguar and Jaguar World. Classic Jaguar is on sale 6 times a year. As the name suggests, its focus is on the older models, iconic cars like the XK120 and 140, XK150, E-Type, XJS, XJ Saloon, and many more. With owners' stories, in-depth historical profiles, and practical ownership advice, Classic Jaguar is the definitive read for fans of these legendary leaping cats. For fans of all ages of Jaguars, there's Jaguar World. On sale every 4 weeks, Jaguar World has been around since 1988 and aims to cover all aspects and models of Jaguar. From the classics to the modern day, Jaguar World brings you the latest news, market trends, owner stories, road tests, practical advice, and more. Both Jaguar World and Classic Jaguar are available in all good newsagents, but you can also buy single copies or subscribe online via shop.kelsey.co.uk. You're listening to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover.
Well, welcome back everyone to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast. We've been talking about Jaguar today. And I think there's a bit of a danger that we've erred on the sort of slightly pessimistic side of the brand. So I thought we'd wrap up today's episode with some slightly more positive thoughts and feelings about the brand.
Good idea, because despite what I've said, I do actually have some.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. Jaguar is such an emotive brand. I think people do care about it, and they're passionate about it. And for all its sort of highs and lows, it's a brand that's achieved an awful lot over the years. People wouldn't be sort of commenting, quite so strongly and emphatically as they do on forums and in magazines about Jaguar if they didn't care about it. I don't see people getting utterly irate about a Hyundai i800 or something like that. I mean, they just don't care about the brand in that kind of way. But I thought what would be quite good. I don't know if you've got any fond Jaguar memories. You've been doing the motoring journalism for 10 years, and I think your father's quite a keen Jaguar man, isn't he? And so you must have some fond Jaguar memories yourself.
Dad he's never owned a Jaguar. He owned the world's ropiest old Daimler 250 V8 because he preferred that to the Mark II. But no, I do, despite, as you said, that it seems that I've spent the past God knows how long sitting in front of a microphone saying how I'm not really that fussed about Jaguars. I do like them. A lot of them I do like. So the XJ particularly is one of my all-time favourite cars from any maker, and I do like and care about the company, and I have had some very good times in them, although most of them have been XJs. I think the time that I really clicked with Jaguar, first time it really this is why people like them, because my early experiences with driving Jags when I got into this profession was the sporty ones. And then I borrowed a Kelsey fleet vehicle, which was the company founder's 4-litre X300 Sovereign. I decided inadvisedly, as it turned out, to try and spend my Christmas break visiting all the bits of my variously dispersed family, which involved driving 1,000 miles to visit different corners of the country in about 5 days. And there's few cars that are better to do 1,000 miles of rather against the clock driving than a 4-litre XJ6. As I was coming back from Dad in Cornwall along the M5 on a frosty winter's afternoon with the frost on the ground, some classic FM on the radio, I had the cruise control on, climate control set just so, and it was just barreling me along through the countryside, through Devon and Somerset at a steady motorway speed in the middle and the fast lanes. And I thought, this is what Jaguar is about. My love for the Series 1 XJ was confirmed when I drove a very early 4.2 manual with overdrive example around the North York moors and out to the Scarborough coast. And again, that's a nice environment to drive any sort of car, but driving that on a nice spring day was, again, just perfect, because it just did everything so well. It did the fast A roads, it did the cruising, it did the twisty roads around the countryside, it did the spirited stuff over the moors, and brings back what an achievement that car was.
Maybe you're touching on something there that's really quite sort of interesting, because for many years BMW was the ultimate driving machine, right? But I think in recent years they've definitely eschewed that kind of priority or principle with their models. They've gone for probably the worst nose job in history with their new grills. But maybe there's an opportunity there for Jaguar to sort of reclaim that dynamic high ground and really kind of play on the fact that they are drivers' cars. And maybe with everything that's gone on this year, the idea of enjoying our leisure time driving rather than flying somewhere is a way to sort of recapture some of that glory. Most of my fond memories regarding Jaguar cars, and I've been very lucky to have lots of them in my time. I don't know if I mentioned I was the editor of the Jaguar World magazine.
I don't think so.
I don't know if that's ever come up, but anyway, numerous sort of drives around Europe in a number of different Jaguar models. Pinnacle for me was driving across America in an X308, because it was a 4-litre V8 308. It was actually a Daimler equivalent because it was a Van den Pla model. But that V8 engine, when you're only paying kind of $3 a gallon or something, and long open roads, and it wasn't about how fast you went, it was just the journey and savouring it. It lapped up the miles. We did 3,500 miles in 9 days, and every single mile of that journey was a pleasure. I don't know, that for me epitomised what a Jaguar is, and it's very similar to your story there about driving the X300 Sovereign that we had. Actually, it was a glorious car to drive. A common theme that we talked about before, the X300 is arguably what the XJ40 should have been when it came out in 86, and the only one to have the AJ16 engine, which I believe is probably the best engine Jaguar ever made, that AJ16. It was a blend of smoothness and power.
Absolutely bomb-proof reliability-wise.
And actually relatively easy to maintain. I mean, I'm not particularly hands-on myself, but I think those that know, those that have the right tools and patience and everything, can easily work on an AJ16 engine, because it hasn't got too much of the newfangled electronics that the more modern engines will have. But onto a buying segment now then, Jack. I know, we've covered quite a lot of ground in Jaguar terms, but I thought it might be quite useful to sort of wrap up with a hypothetical shopping exercise.
Excellent, they're always good. To
prove what Jaguars we would own given certain budget points, and whether that provides inspiration or guidance for other people, I wouldn't dare say. But let's start with a lower price point of sort of up to £5,000. What would be your Jaguar of choice?
It would, feeding in very nicely from what I said, it would be, and I'd have money left over from the 5k budget for this, I would buy the best X300 Sovereign, or even preferably a Daimler 6. You could get an absolutely pristine one of that with budget for doing all the suspension rubbers several times over.
Because I'm indecisive, I didn't write down one choice, I wrote down three. But an XJR X300 would be one of my choices there. I think I can just about get one for £5, and if that wasn't sufficient, I'd probably just wuss out and buy an S-Type, because we've not talked about the S-Type too much, but I've owned one myself, and we ran a couple of S-Types on fleet before. The design of the car was obviously, very divisive. Some people either loved the sort of alternative styling, the curvaceous sort of Mark II inspired styling. Other people absolutely detested it. That kind of just made me like it more, that it was a bit of an underdog, maybe a bit of an ugly duckling car. And actually, in terms of overall competence, it was actually really good. A rear drive layout. It was actually more practical than the XJ. I think it was a really good car, and I had a S-Type R, and it was fabulous. I don't think I'd get an S-Type R for $5,000 these days. Certainly not a good one, but you could certainly get an O2 onwards facelift, really good condition, low mileage S-Type for $5,000 and under, and I think it would be a really good car if you wanted an entry level Jaguar. So that would be my other alternative if an X300 wasn't quite your bag. What about moving up the price scale? What about if you've got £15,000 to spend? We've got a bit more budget to play with now. What would be your choice?
You gazumped me, because I would go for an S-Type R. I was lucky enough to very briefly drive yours when you had it, and although I'm not a fan of the styling of the S-Type in general, you don't have to look at the outside when you're in it, and the overall competence of all the I've driven a variety of S-Type specs, and they're a very nice car to drive and very well sorted. And the S-Type R just has that one of those unique. I think it's one of those uniquely Jaguar things. But it's just so good at everything. It's a good sports saloon. It's a good comfortable car. It can just waft. It can push you back into the seat with the acceleration. I'd probably have one of those.
Well, listen. Here's the thing: is that if you can't find an S-Type R and you're not a great fan of the S-Type R styling, you could always go for either the XF SV8 or the XFR even at $15,000, because $15,000 I think just about nicks you into a 5-litre supercharged XFR, and that would certainly be on my shopping list at that kind of budget. And you've got all the dynamic capabilities of the S-Type R, but actually you've got the more modern styling, and I think an XFR is hard to beat at that kind of money. And I'm guessing if you like the classic stuff, I mean, would $15,000 still buy you an early Series XJ? Maybe not a Series 1, but
it would buy you a Series 2, a fairly nice Series 2 or Series 3. It would probably get you a Series 1, maybe a 2.8 that needed a little bit of work, but nothing that wouldn't be a complete teabag at that price. Which brings us on nicely to the next price range, and I think you suggested we consider stuff that was between 10k and 30k, and XJ6 Series 1 4.2 manual overdrive straight in, that was no qualms about that one. Did vaguely wonder way up with, do I get an XJC? And I thought no, because I'd always been thinking that an XJC fundamentally, although they look fantastic, doesn't bring anything that the saloon doesn't have. I think a 4.2 Series 1 XJ6 is peak Jaguar.
I think at around the $30,000 mark I could probably get my dream 2-car Jaguar garage, in as much as $30,000, like you say, would probably buy you a really good example of an XJ6 Series 1 4.2, and I would absolutely agree with your choice there. And then another $30,000 on top. You see, I've just immediately doubled the budget. This is the sort of the danger of the indecisive, you see. If I had the same budget again, I would then go shopping for one of the modern sports cars. So I'd either go for a really late X150 XKR. Jaguar in my eyes should have continued with the XK, even with the F-Type, because the F-Type was much sportier than the XK, and I think the XK could have still continued as a kind of sporting Grand Tourer and been the kind of alternative to that. But anyway, that's another coulda, woulda, shoulda episode of Jaguar. So I'd either have one of those, or I would have an F-Type, actually, a 3-litre V6S, because they're not everyone's cup of tea. Again, a lot of traditional Jaguar guys don't like the F-Type, I think, because it's a little bit too hard-edged. But I do like them.
Yeah, can't fault either of those.
So then we go to sort of, almost the world's your oyster. $30,000 plus. What are you going to buy?
This is the only one where I actually noted down a choice of two, because the problem is, I've kind of hit my peak at a much lower budget. If I had money no object, I'd just fill a garage with XJs of various sorts. I think if you handed me and said have a Jaguar unlimited budget, or effectively unlimited budget, I would have either an XFR S Sport Brake, or I would order myself a top spec I-Pace and see what it was really like and enjoy the electric modern waftiness.
A bit like you, as the budget climbs up, the greedier and more indecisive I become, because I think you mentioned the XFRS Sport Brake,
Indeed.
Which is a phenomenal car. So actually, I would have that as well, and then I'd like to spend the same again on an early Series 1 E-Type. That completely blows my budget, but again, that would be another dream 2-car Jaguar garage if I was allowed to have one. I think the very fact that we've managed to sort of pick off quite a few desirable cars there just does show how Jaguar has managed to pull at the heartstrings for many years, because we've just spanned a 50-year product line up there. It shows there's still, desirability in spades. It's just that it's littered with lots of other sort of pangs of regret about what might have been, I suppose.
And that's always the frustrating thing. It is the what might have been, because the problem has never really been with the cars. There's never been a truly bad Jaguar. I mean, you can say that the X-Type and the S-Type were commercial failures, and you can pick flaws in the, it would have been better if they'd done this, but an X-Type is not a bad car, and there's never been a complete clangor over Jaguar. If you look at some of the absolute bombs that some other manufacturers have turned out, I mean, you can pick any number from the British motor industry, let alone around the world. There's never been a Jaguar that really, if someone said, no, you've got to drive that now, that is your car, you think, well, fair enough, that's as bad as they get. I think that's what kind of keeps the dream alive, that if they were just churning out bad strings of just dud cars, you think, well, nothing lost. But it's the fact that they actually, against the odds, keep turning out either very good cars or tantalisingly close to being really good cars that keeps people coming back to them and keeps them invested in them.
I think that's a really good point, and probably a really suitable point to end today's podcast. We've probably waffled on for an awful long time now and given our colleague Joe an awful lot of editing work to do, but hey, there we go. Jack, thanks very much for your time. I do hope we can do another Classics World On Your Marques podcast again soon. I know we've listed quite a number of car makes that we'd like to wax lyrical on. Jaguar felt like a fitting first episode, but we've got lots of other brands we could cover. I look forward to being able to do that again in a future episode.
Been a pleasure, Phil, any time. Although, can we try and limit it in the future to Marques, which you haven't been the long-time editor of a specialist magazine about them?
Yes, okay. Well, that will be very easy, because that is pretty much the one I'd spent the longest on. So that's good. I don't know if I mentioned I was the editor of Jaguar or not, but anyway. Jack, thanks very much for your time. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope that was enjoyable and perhaps conjured up some debate and thoughts amongst yourselves. Do feel free to sort of drop us a line. We're at Classics World and at classicsworld.co.uk. Feel free to drop us a line. But thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again next time.
You've been listening to the Classics World On Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover. For more, visit classicsworld.co.uk or youtube.com/classicsworlduk.